The room was filled with the soft hum of jazz music and the clinking of expensive crystal glasses. It was one of those exclusive gatherings where only the wealthiest, most influential men sat around, indulging in expensive cigars and aged whiskey, laughing at jokes that weren't really funny. Sebastian Montgomery sat at the head of the table, his posture relaxed but confident, his dark suit tailored to perfection. He was a man who had everything: money, power, charm, and a reputation for living life on his own terms. Across from him sat Maxwell Sinclair, his longtime friend and rival, a man just as wealthy and self-assured but with a sharper edge to his personality. He swirled his drink lazily, watching Sebastian with a smirk. "You know, Montgomery, I'm starting to think you've lost your edge," Maxwell said, leaning back in his chair. Sebastian raised an eyebrow, taking a slow sip of his whiskey. "Is that so?" Maxwell grinned. "You've done it all, haven't you? Dated the most beautiful women, traveled the world, bought whatever you wanted. Life must be awfully dull for you now." Sebastian chuckled. "Boredom is a sign of intelligence, Sinclair. Some of us outgrow the cheap thrills." Maxwell laughed. "Cheap thrills? Don't act like you're above it all, Sebastian. We both know you crave excitement. The problem is, you always play it safe. You choose women who fit your lifestyle, people who look good beside you. But what if you had to do something truly outrageous? Something unpredictable?" Sebastian leaned forward, intrigued. "And what exactly do you have in mind?" Maxwell's smirk deepened. He tapped his fingers against his glass thoughtfully before saying, "I bet you wouldn't dare marry someone completely beneath your status. Someone who doesn't belong in your world. No models, no socialites, no women from our circles." Sebastian laughed, shaking his head. "That's ridiculous. Why would I do that?" "Because it's a challenge," Maxwell said, his eyes glinting with amusement. "You claim to be a man who can handle anything, but would you really risk your precious reputation for the sake of a gamble?" Sebastian scoffed, but he could feel the weight of Maxwell's words settling into his mind. The challenge was absurd, but there was something undeniably tempting about it. He had spent years conquering everything in his path, from business empires to high-stakes poker games. But this? This was new. "What's in it for me?" Sebastian asked, swirling the whiskey in his glass. Maxwell shrugged. "The satisfaction of proving me wrong. And, of course, I'll make it interesting." He leaned forward. "If you actually go through with it, if you marry someone completely opposite of your usual type and stay married for a full year, I'll hand over my shares in Sinclair Enterprises." Sebastian's eyes flickered with interest. Sinclair Enterprises was one of the few rival companies that had managed to keep up with his own. Acquiring those shares would be a major win. "And if I back out?" he asked. "Then you publicly admit that I was right about you," Maxwell said. "That you only go for what's easy, for what fits your lifestyle. You'll have to admit, in front of everyone, that you're a coward." Sebastian's jaw tightened. He had never been one to back down from a challenge, especially not one that questioned his pride. The idea was ridiculous, marrying a complete stranger, someone far removed from his world. But wasn't that exactly the kind of unpredictable thrill he had been craving? "Fine," he said, setting his glass down with a decisive thud. "I'll do it." Maxwell raised an eyebrow. "You're serious?" Sebastian smirked. "Give me a week." Maxwell laughed, shaking his head in amusement. "This is going to be fun." As the night continued and the drinks kept flowing, Sebastian felt a strange excitement settle in his chest. He had no idea who he would marry or how he would even go about finding someone so opposite from everything he was used to. But one thing was certain, he never lost a bet. And he wasn't about to start now. Sebastian Montgomery sat in the back seat of his sleek black car, staring out at the city streets with an unreadable expression. It had been 4 days since he had agreed to Maxwell's bet, and the reality of his impulsive decision was finally sinking in. How was he supposed to find a woman who fit Maxwell's ridiculous conditions? He had considered different possibilities, a waitress, a store clerk, maybe even a struggling artist. But none of them seemed right. He needed someone truly unexpected, someone completely opposite from the glamorous women he was used to. Someone that would shock his social circle. His driver pulled up to the gates of the Montgomery estate, and as Sebastian was about to step out, something caught his eye. A woman sat on the cold marble steps just outside the entrance. She was hunched over, her thin arms wrapped tightly around herself as if trying to shrink from the world. Her clothes were tattered, her hair unkempt, and her face bore a deep scar running from her cheekbone to her jaw. Sebastian paused. Something about her was striking, not in a conventional way, but in the way her presence stood in stark contrast to everything around her. "Who is she?" Sebastian asked his driver. The man hesitated. "She's been sitting there on and off for weeks. The security guards have tried to chase her away, but she keeps coming back. Doesn't cause trouble, just sits there." Sebastian took a slow breath. She was perfect. He stepped out of the car and walked toward her. His polished leather shoes clicked against the pavement, and she stiffened slightly but didn't look up. When he stopped in front of her, she finally lifted her head, revealing sharp, wary eyes that had clearly seen too much of the world's cruelty. "Are you lost?" he asked. She let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Can't be lost if you have nowhere to go." Sebastian smirked. He appreciated her sharpness. "What's your name?" She hesitated before answering. "Charlotte." "Charlotte," he repeated, testing the name on his tongue. "How long have you been living like this?" She narrowed her eyes. "What do you care?" Sebastian crouched down so they were at eye level. Most people in his world would have recoiled at the sight of her scar, but he simply studied her, as if trying to understand something. "I have a proposition for you," he said finally. Charlotte snorted. "Let me guess. You'll give me a couple of dollars if I run some errand for you?" He smiled faintly. "Not quite." He straightened and adjusted the cuff of his tailored suit. "I want you to marry me." Charlotte froze. For a moment, she wondered if she had heard him wrong. "What?" Sebastian crossed his arms. "I need a wife. You need stability. It's a simple arrangement." Charlotte stared at him, waiting for the punchline. "Is this a joke?" she asked. "No joke." She let out a bitter laugh. "Right. The rich man wants to marry the homeless woman. Sounds like a fairy tale, doesn't it?" "It's not a fairy tale," he said coolly. "It's a deal." Charlotte studied him carefully. There was no amusement in his expression, no sign that he was playing some kind of cruel trick on her. But still, the idea was absurd. "Why?" she demanded. "Why would someone like you do this?" Sebastian hesitated, but only for a moment. "I have my reasons." Charlotte eyed him warily. "And what do you expect from me in return?" "Nothing," he said simply. "Be my wife, in name only. We'll get married, you'll live in my house, and you'll be taken care of. After a year, we part ways, and you'll have enough money to start fresh." Her fingers tightened around the fabric of her worn-out coat. It sounded too good to be true. She had spent years struggling, sleeping in shelters, scraping by on whatever she could find. And now this man, this impossibly rich man, was offering her a way out? But at what cost? "What's the catch?" she asked. Sebastian smirked. "There isn't one. Unless you consider living in luxury for a year a burden." Charlotte's mind raced. Everything about this felt wrong. And yet, was it really worse than what she was already enduring? She could have warmth. A bed. Food. A chance to breathe. But could she trust him? She looked up at him again, searching his face for some hidden malice. He was handsome, impossibly so, with sharp cheekbones and piercing eyes that belonged to a man used to getting what he wanted. And yet, there was something else beneath the confidence, something tired, maybe even lonely. Against every instinct in her body, she made a decision. Fine, she said, the word feeling foreign on her tongue. I'll do it. Sebastian nodded as if he had expected no other answer. Good, he said. We get married tomorrow. The wedding. The next morning, Charlotte found herself standing in the middle of City Hall, wearing a plain dress Sebastian had bought for her that morning. It was simple but clean, far better than anything she had worn in years. Sebastian stood beside her, looking as impeccable as ever in a sharp black suit. He held himself with the same confidence as always, as if this was just another business deal. A judge stood before them, reading through the legal formalities. Charlotte felt a strange numbness settle over her. This was really happening. She was marrying a man she had met just yesterday, a man who had offered her marriage like it was nothing more than a transaction. She glanced at Sebastian, who stood expressionless, his gaze focused straight ahead. Was this what her life had come to? Marrying a stranger for survival? Do you, Sebastian Montgomery, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? Sebastian didn't hesitate. I do. The judge turned to Charlotte. And do you, Charlotte, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? Charlotte's throat tightened. She had nothing. No family. No home. No future. And now, she had this. I do, she said quietly. The judge nodded. By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Sebastian slid a ring onto her finger. It was simple, yet the diamond gleamed against her rough, scarred hands. They didn't kiss. There were no smiles, no joy. It was done. As they walked out of City Hall, Sebastian turned to her. We leave for the estate now, he said. Charlotte nodded stiffly, feeling the weight of her decision settle over her. She had just become Mrs. Montgomery. And she had no idea what that truly meant. Charlotte stood at the entrance of the Montgomery estate, staring up at the grand mansion before her. It was a palace compared to the places she had known, shelters, back alleys, abandoned buildings. The towering white columns and massive glass windows looked as though they belonged in a movie. It felt unreal, like she had stepped into someone else's life. Sebastian walked ahead of her, barely glancing back. Come inside, he said briskly. Charlotte hesitated before following him through the enormous double doors. The moment she stepped inside, she felt out of place. The marble floors gleamed under the chandelier's light, reflecting the image of a woman who didn't belong. Her simple dress, her scarred face, her unsure posture, all of it clashed with the elegance around her. A row of house staff stood by the staircase, their expressions polite but unreadable. An older woman, dressed in a sharp black uniform, stepped forward. Mrs. Montgomery, she said, her voice smooth and professional. I am Mrs. Hastings, the head housekeeper. If you need anything, please don't hesitate to ask. Mrs. Montgomery. The title sounded foreign. Charlotte forced a nod. Sebastian turned to the housekeeper. Show her to her room. Without another word, he strode off down one of the long hallways, already lost in his own world. Charlotte let out a quiet breath. She had expected this. Their marriage was a business deal, nothing more. Still, the coldness of it all settled heavily in her chest. Life in the mansion. Days passed, but Charlotte never quite felt at home. The mansion was beautiful but empty, like a museum she wasn't allowed to touch. She had everything she could ever need, fine clothes, expensive meals, a bed softer than anything she had ever slept in, but she had no place here. The staff were kind, but they treated her with a careful distance. They were always polite, always respectful, but she could hear their whispers when they thought she wasn't listening. She doesn't belong here. Can you believe Mr. Montgomery married her? Poor thing. He barely looks at her. She had expected that, too. Sebastian barely acknowledged her presence. He was always busy, meetings, phone calls, business trips. Sometimes, she would catch a glimpse of him at breakfast, flipping through a newspaper without a word, or in the evening, pouring himself a drink in the study before disappearing into his office. Once, she had tried to start a conversation. "How was your day?" she had asked at dinner one evening. Sebastian barely looked up from his plate. "Fine." She waited for him to ask about hers. He didn't. After a few more nights of silence, she stopped trying. A quiet strength. With nothing else to do, Charlotte found herself drawn to the mansion's vast library. She had always loved books, even when life had made it impossible to own them. As a child, she would sneak into the town library and get lost in stories, forgetting for a little while that the real world was cruel. Now, surrounded by endless shelves of books, she felt a strange sense of peace. One afternoon, as she sat curled up in a chair by the window, Sebastian walked in. He paused when he saw her, as if surprised to find her there. "You read?" he asked. Charlotte glanced up from her book. "I always have." He raised an eyebrow. "What are you reading?" She hesitated before turning the book over to show him the cover. "Pride and Prejudice." Sebastian smirked. "A classic." She studied him for a moment. "Have you read it?" "A long time ago," he admitted. "Didn't seem very realistic to me." Charlotte tilted her head. "Why?" Sebastian leaned against the bookshelf. "Because real life isn't about grand declarations of love and misunderstandings that magically fix themselves. It's about power and choices." Charlotte closed her book. "And yet, you married a homeless woman. Sounds like something out of a novel to me." Sebastian chuckled softly, the sound surprising both of them. For the first time, Charlotte saw something different in his expression, curiosity, maybe even amusement. But just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. "I have a meeting," he said, pushing off the bookshelf. "Enjoy your book." Charlotte watched him leave, feeling a strange shift in the air. A growing curiosity. After that, Sebastian started noticing her more. He would walk past the library and see her lost in a book, her scarred face relaxed in concentration. He would come home late and find her sitting in the garden, staring up at the sky as if searching for something beyond the stars. She was different from anyone he had ever known. She didn't try to impress him, didn't fawn over his wealth or status. She existed in his world but remained untouched by it, like an outsider who had learned to survive on her own terms. One evening, he found himself watching her from across the room as she arranged flowers in a vase. "You don't seem afraid of being alone," he said suddenly. Charlotte glanced at him. "I'm used to it." Sebastian frowned. He wasn't sure why, but that answer unsettled him. "Did you ever imagine your life turning out like this?" he asked. She let out a quiet laugh. "Married to a billionaire? Living in a mansion?" She shook her head. "No. But I also never imagined I'd lose everything. Life has a way of surprising you." Sebastian studied her, realizing that, for all his wealth, he had never known the kind of hardship she had endured. "You're stronger than you look," he murmured. Charlotte smirked. "You're not the first person to underestimate me." For the first time since their marriage, Sebastian felt something shift inside him. He had taken this bet for a thrill, for something reckless and different. But Charlotte Montgomery was proving to be far more than he had ever expected. The fire crackled softly in the grand fireplace, casting flickering shadows across the dimly lit library. Charlotte sat curled up in the oversized armchair, her legs tucked beneath her as she read. The book in her hands was old, its pages worn from time and use. She had lost herself in the story, savoring the peace of the quiet evening. Sebastian stood in the doorway, watching her. He wasn't sure when it had started, this strange habit of noticing her. It had been months since she had moved into his home, yet she still carried herself like an outsider, always keeping a quiet distance. But tonight, something drew him toward her. Clearing his throat, he stepped forward. "You always spend your evenings in here." Charlotte looked up, startled. I like the quiet, she said simply. Sebastian walked over to the liquor cabinet and poured himself a glass of whiskey. He hesitated before turning to her. What are you reading? She lifted the book slightly. It's an old poetry collection. Sebastian raised an eyebrow. Poetry? Charlotte smirked. Surprised? He took a sip of his drink, settling into the chair across from her. A little. I never had the patience for poetry. Charlotte tilted her head. That's because you never read the right ones. Sebastian chuckled. Enlighten me then. Charlotte hesitated, then flipped through the book before reading aloud. Her voice was soft, steady. Love is not loud, nor does it seek to be seen. It lingers in quiet moments, in the spaces between words. She closed the book and looked at him. It means love isn't about grand gestures. It's about the little things. Sebastian stared at her, something in his chest tightening. You believe that? Charlotte exhaled slowly. I used to. Sebastian leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. Tell me about your past. Charlotte hesitated. No one had ever really asked before. Not with genuine interest. But there was something about the way he was looking at her tonight, less guarded, less distant. She took a deep breath. I had a family once. A small one. My parents died when I was young, so it was just me and my little sister, Anna. A soft, bittersweet smile crossed her lips. She was everything to me. I worked every job I could find to keep a roof over our heads. It wasn't much, but we had each other. Sebastian listened intently. What happened? Charlotte's expression darkened. She got sick. A disease we couldn't afford to treat. I tried everything, begging, borrowing, anything to get her help. But in the end, I failed her. Sebastian didn't speak. Charlotte swallowed hard. After she died, I lost everything. The apartment, the jobs, eventually, I ended up on the streets. And once you fall that far, it's almost impossible to climb back up. Sebastian ran a hand through his hair. I'm sorry. She let out a small, humorless laugh. Don't be. Life isn't fair, and I learned that early. Sebastian stared into his glass, the amber liquid swirling inside. I lost someone too. Charlotte looked at him, surprised. My mother, he admitted. She died when I was young. My father, he was a ruthless businessman. Cared more about money than people. He threw me into the corporate world before I even had a chance to figure out who I was. He let out a bitter chuckle. I inherited wealth, but never love. Charlotte studied him. For the first time, she saw beyond the arrogance, beyond the cold exterior. He was just as lost as she was. I suppose we're both running from ghosts, she murmured. Sebastian met her gaze. Maybe. A silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that felt like understanding. Then, unexpectedly, Charlotte laughed, a real, genuine laugh. Sebastian frowned. What? She shook her head, smiling. I never imagined having this kind of conversation with you. Sebastian smirked. You and me both. That night, they talked for hours, exchanging stories, sharing pieces of themselves they had never shared with anyone before. And without realizing it, they had crossed a line, no longer just strangers in a forced marriage, but something more. The truth revealed. Days turned into weeks, and their connection grew stronger. The library became their space, a quiet refuge where they could be themselves. Sebastian found himself looking for Charlotte more often, making excuses to sit with her, to hear her thoughts. He was drawn to her quiet strength, the way she saw the world differently from anyone he had ever known. And Charlotte? She found herself softening toward him, laughing at his sarcastic remarks, enjoying his company in ways she hadn't expected. But just as something real was beginning to take root, fate decided to remind Sebastian of the truth. One evening, as he sat in his office, his phone buzzed. A message from Maxwell. Your anniversary is in 2 weeks. You won the bet. Time to celebrate. Sebastian's stomach dropped. The bet. The entire reason he had married Charlotte in the first place. His fingers tightened around the phone. He had pushed it to the back of his mind, convinced himself it didn't matter. But now, it was staring him in the face. And for the first time in his life, Sebastian Montgomery felt ashamed. He had started this marriage as a joke, but somewhere along the way, Charlotte had become real to him. And he had been lying to her the entire time. That night, he found Charlotte in the library, curled up in her usual chair, reading. He stood in the doorway, his heart pounding. She looked up and smiled softly. You look like you've seen a ghost. Sebastian stepped inside, closing the door behind him. We need to talk. Charlotte frowned at his tone. What is it? He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. I need to tell you something. And I need you to listen to all of it before you say anything. She set her book down, concern etched on her face. Okay. Sebastian exhaled slowly. When I married you, it wasn't because I wanted to. It was a bet. Charlotte's body stiffened. Sebastian pushed forward, his voice heavy. Maxwell dared me to marry someone beneath my status. He thought I wouldn't do it. I took the bet because I was bored. Because I wanted to prove him wrong. Silence. The kind that suffocates. Charlotte stared at him, her expression unreadable. Sebastian swallowed hard. But it changed, Charlotte. You changed it. I never expected to feel, he stopped himself. I never expected you to matter. Charlotte stood up slowly, her movements deliberate. Sebastian reached for her. Charlotte. Don't. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through him like a blade. He saw it then, the heartbreak in her eyes, the walls rebuilding themselves brick by brick. I trusted you, she whispered. I didn't mean to. You didn't mean to care, she finished for him. But you did. And now you don't know what to do with it. Sebastian clenched his jaw. I didn't want to hurt you. Charlotte let out a shaky breath. But you did. A long silence passed between them. Then, without another word, Charlotte turned and walked out of the room. By morning, she was gone. Sebastian searched her room, but it was empty. No sign of her. Except for the note on the pillow. I hope one day you will be honest with yourself about who you truly are. Sebastian stood there, gripping the paper, feeling the weight of his own choices crushing him. For the first time in his life, winning felt like the worst kind of loss. Sebastian Montgomery had never known true emptiness until now. The mansion, once a place of quiet comfort, now felt unbearably hollow. The air was too still, the rooms too large, and every corner seemed to hold a memory of her, Charlotte, sitting by the library window, her fingers brushing over the worn pages of a book, Charlotte, standing in the garden at night, staring up at the stars as if searching for something beyond this world. But she was gone. And Sebastian had no one to blame but himself. For the first time in his life, his wealth and power meant nothing. What use was money when the one person he wanted had disappeared? He had to find her. The desperate search begins. Sebastian wasted no time. He had never searched for anyone before, people always came to him. But now, he found himself in a situation completely out of his control. His first stop was the security team. Find her, he ordered, his voice sharp with urgency. Check every camera, every street near the mansion. I want to know where she went. Within an hour, they had an answer. She took a taxi from the estate, sir, one of his men reported. She was dropped off downtown, near the East End. Sebastian's stomach tightened. The East End. A part of the city he had only ever driven past. A place he had never once stepped foot in. He grabbed his coat and left without a word. The streets that swallowed her. The East End was nothing like the world Sebastian knew. The luxury cars and designer stores were replaced with old buildings, dim streetlights, and people whose eyes carried the weight of hardship. Sebastian walked through the streets, scanning every face. He had brought a picture of Charlotte with him, but the more people he asked, the more he realized just how vast and merciless the city could be. "Have you seen this woman?" he asked a street vendor. The old man squinted at the picture, then shook his head. "No, sir. Sorry." He moved on to a small diner, pushing open the glass door with a sense of urgency. A tired-looking waitress glanced up. "Need a table?" Sebastian shook his head, pulling out the picture. "I'm looking for someone. She might have come through here." The waitress took the picture, studying it for a long moment. Then she sighed. "Yeah, I've seen her." Sebastian's heart jumped. "When? Where?" The waitress wiped her hands on her apron. "Came in a few nights ago. Ordered coffee, didn't drink much of it." She looked lost. Sebastian's chest tightened. "Did she say where she was going?" The woman shook her head. "No. Just sat there for a while, then left. I think she was heading toward the shelters." Sebastian nodded, slipping $100 bill onto the counter. "Thank you." The waitress stared at the money but said nothing as he walked out the door. The shelters and dead ends. Sebastian visited every shelter in the city. At the first one, a kind-eyed woman at the front desk shook her head. "No, sir. We haven't seen her." At the second, an older man rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "I think she was here, but she didn't stay long." At the third, he found a small trace of hope. "She was here," a young volunteer said. "Stayed for a night, but she left early in the morning. She didn't say where she was going." Sebastian ran a hand through his hair, frustration tightening in his chest. She was always one step ahead, slipping through his fingers before he could reach her. Still, he refused to give up. Returning to the beginning. Days passed. Sebastian barely slept, barely ate. His employees whispered about their boss's strange behavior, about the dark circles under his eyes and the way he no longer cared about meetings, deals, or wealth. Maxwell had sent him another text, something smug, something taunting, but Sebastian didn't even bother reading it. The bet, the shares, the so-called victory, none of it mattered anymore. All that mattered was Charlotte. With nowhere else to turn, Sebastian went back to the place where he had first found her, the steps outside his estate. She had sat there once, curled up against the cold, invisible to the world. And now, he sat there. For hours. As if hoping that somehow, she would come back. But she didn't. A soft drizzle began to fall, the cold seeping into his bones, but Sebastian didn't move. For the first time in his life, he had no answers, no plan, no control. He had spent his whole life chasing wealth, power, and reputation. He had lived as if he were untouchable. But now, stripped of everything that had once defined him, he felt something new. Loneliness. Real, crushing loneliness. And he understood, too late, that Charlotte had been the only thing that had ever made him feel alive. The search wasn't over. He would find her. No matter how long it took. The seasons had changed. The bitter cold of winter had given way to the soft warmth of spring, and now, nearly a year later, the golden hues of autumn painted the city in shades of red and orange. Sebastian Montgomery had changed, too. He was no longer the man who once made reckless bets, who lived for power and wealth alone. The months without Charlotte had stripped him of all his illusions, forcing him to confront the emptiness he had ignored for so long. He had searched for her relentlessly. At first, with desperation, throwing money at private investigators, scouring every street and shelter. But Charlotte was a ghost, always slipping away before he could reach her. And then, after months of failure, he had stopped searching the way a businessman would. Instead, he had begun looking for her the way a man searches for something he cannot live without. And that was how he found her. A familiar figure on a park bench. It was a crisp afternoon when Sebastian walked through the park, his hands in the pockets of his coat. He hadn't meant to come here, his feet had simply led him, as if drawn by some unseen force. Then, through the falling leaves, he saw her. Charlotte. She sat on a wooden bench beneath an old oak tree, her posture relaxed, a small notebook in her lap. The wind played with her hair, and for the first time, Sebastian noticed how different she looked. She was healthier now, her cheeks no longer hollow, her clothes simple but clean. She no longer looked like someone trying to disappear. For a long moment, he simply stood there, afraid that if he moved, she would vanish. Then, as if sensing his presence, Charlotte looked up. Their eyes met. And Sebastian felt his heart stop. A moment of truth. Charlotte didn't move. She didn't look away. Sebastian swallowed hard, then, slowly, he stepped forward. She watched him carefully, her expression unreadable. When he was close enough to touch her, he did something he had never done before. He knelt. Right there, in the middle of the park, in front of strangers and falling leaves and the cool autumn breeze, Sebastian Montgomery, the man who had once prided himself on being untouchable, dropped to his knees before her. Charlotte's breath hitched. Sebastian exhaled shakily. "I never stopped looking for you." She said nothing. He searched her face, looking for anger, for pain, for anything that would tell him what she was thinking. But she only stared at him, waiting. So he spoke. "I was a fool," he admitted, his voice raw. "I hurt you in ways I can't take back. And I know I have no right to ask for anything from you." He hesitated, then added, "But I have to try." Charlotte's fingers tightened around her notebook, but she still said nothing. Sebastian let out a breath. "I thought I knew what mattered in life. Money. Control. Winning." He shook his head. "But then you came into my life, and everything changed. And I didn't even realize it until you were gone." A muscle tightened in Charlotte's jaw. "You had a funny way of showing it," she said quietly. Sebastian flinched. He deserved that. He deserved worse. "I know," he said. "And I'll regret it for the rest of my life." Charlotte looked down at her lap, her fingers tracing the edges of her notebook. Sebastian took a shaky breath. "I love you, Charlotte." The words felt strange and unfamiliar on his tongue, but they were the only truth he had left. Not because of guilt. Not because of loneliness. But because you're the only person who ever saw me for who I really am. And because losing you was the worst mistake I've ever made. A long silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, Charlotte opened her notebook. She tore out a page and held it out to him. Sebastian hesitated before taking it, his hands shaking slightly as he unfolded the paper. The words were handwritten, simple but powerful. "Forgiveness is not about forgetting. It's about choosing to let go of the pain and making room for something new." Sebastian's throat tightened. He looked up at her. "Does this mean?" Charlotte exhaled. "It means I don't hate you," she admitted. "And maybe I don't want to run anymore." Sebastian felt something break inside him. Relief, hope, love, things he had long since buried beneath his pride. He reached for her hand, and this time, she didn't pull away. And in that quiet autumn afternoon, with a single torn page between them, they found the beginning of something new. The sun was just beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the small garden behind Sebastian's estate. The air was crisp with the scent of fresh roses, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves on the tall oak trees. Unlike their first wedding, this one wasn't held in a cold, impersonal city hall. There were no business deals hidden beneath the vows, no ulterior motives, no bets to win. This time, it was real. Charlotte stood at the edge of the garden, her fingers lightly brushing over the simple white fabric of her dress. It wasn't extravagant, no designer label, no sparkling jewels, but it was hers. And for the first time in a long time, she felt beautiful. She looked ahead, her heart pounding as she saw Sebastian standing near the altar. He wasn't wearing the arrogant smirk she had once hated. There was no mask of indifference, no trace of the man who had once viewed marriage as nothing more than a game. Instead, he was looking at her as if she was the only thing that mattered in the entire world. And maybe, she was. The vows that mattered. Sebastian's breath hitched slightly as Charlotte took slow steps toward him. His heart was racing, a strange, unfamiliar feeling for a man who had spent his life calculating every decision. But there was nothing calculated about this. This was love. Their guests were few, only those who truly mattered. Mrs. Hastings, the housekeeper who had quietly watched over Charlotte during her lonely months in the mansion, sat in the front row, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. A few of Charlotte's friends from the shelter, the ones who had helped her rebuild her life after she had left, smiled at her with pride. Even a few of Sebastian's old colleagues, the ones who had noticed his transformation over the past year, sat with quiet approval. As Charlotte reached him, Sebastian gently took her hands in his grip firm but careful, as if afraid she might disappear again. The officiant cleared his throat, smiling warmly. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of two souls who have traveled a long and difficult road to find each other." Charlotte exhaled softly, squeezing Sebastian's hands. Sebastian looked at her, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I never thought I would find myself here, standing before you again," he began. "And the truth is, I didn't deserve a second chance. But you gave it to me anyway." He swallowed. "You taught me what love really means. That it isn't about power or control, but about trust, respect, and standing beside each other even when things aren't easy." Charlotte felt her chest tighten. Sebastian's voice softened. "I promise to love you, not just in the easy moments, but in the hard ones. Not just when life is beautiful, but when it's messy. I promise to be honest with you, to never hide behind pride or fear again. And most of all, I promise that for as long as I have breath in my body, I will choose you. Every single day." Charlotte blinked rapidly, trying to stop the tears from spilling over. She took a shaky breath and smiled up at him. "I never expected this," she admitted. "Not from you. Not from us." A small, almost amused laugh escaped her lips. "When you first asked me to marry you, it was a transaction. A deal. But somehow, against all odds, you became my home." Sebastian's jaw tightened, his eyes glistening. Charlotte continued, her voice steady but full of warmth. "I promise to love you for who you are, not who the world expects you to be. I promise to remind you, when you forget, that you are more than your money, more than your reputation. And I promise that no matter what happens, I will never run again." Sebastian let out a shaky breath, his fingers tightening around hers. The officiant smiled. "Do you, Sebastian Montgomery, take Charlotte to be your lawfully wedded wife, to cherish and love, in all the days to come?" Sebastian didn't hesitate. "I do." The officiant turned to Charlotte. "And do you, Charlotte, take Sebastian to be your lawfully wedded husband, to stand beside and love, in all the days to come?" Charlotte's lips trembled, but her voice was clear. "I do." The kiss that changed everything. Unlike their first wedding, where the kiss had been forced and meaningless, this time, Sebastian reached for Charlotte with careful reverence. He cupped her face gently, as if she were something precious, something irreplaceable. And when he kissed her, it was not just a promise, it was a vow, a silent reassurance that this was real. The small crowd erupted into applause, but Sebastian barely heard it. All he could feel was Charlotte, her warmth, her softness, the way she melted into him like she had finally found where she belonged. And maybe, so had he. The dance in the garden. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the small reception began. It was nothing extravagant, just a dinner under the stars, laughter echoing through the garden. Charlotte had never felt so light, so free. As music played softly in the background, Sebastian extended his hand toward her. "Dance with me?" Charlotte raised an amused brow. "I didn't know you danced." Sebastian smirked. "I don't. But for you, I'll try." She laughed and placed her hand in his. They swayed under the twinkling fairy lights, the world fading away until it was just them. "I love you," Sebastian murmured against her hair. Charlotte closed her eyes, her heart full. "I love you too." And for the first time in his life, Sebastian Montgomery knew the true meaning of wealth. Because in Charlotte, he had found something priceless. He had found love.